Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the blinding light of Olympus. Well, blinding if you forget to bring shades, because Apollo really doesn't do subtle. You know the type, brilliant at everything, talented at music, archery, healing, and prophecy, but also just a little too smug about it. If you ran into him at a party, he'd be the guy casually pulling out a lyre and saying, "Oh, this old thing, I just invented music with it. No big deal." So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me in the comments what city you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing the map of sleepy travelers stretch across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a sunlit field, somewhere between myth and memory. The grass is warm beneath your feet, the kind of glow that says, "Congratulations, you've wandered into the domain of Apollo." It's easy to see why the Greeks imagined him radiating lights, essentially the human embodiment of the golden hour. But here's the thing, gods with too much ego rarely stay out of trouble for long. You notice Apollo striding through the meadow, bow slung over his shoulder, lyre dangling casually from his hand. He doesn't just walk, he glides, the way a person does when they know the universe likes them. Ancient poets describe him as youthful, athletic, eternally shining, but if we're honest, he's got that air of someone who hasn't yet learned the fine art of humility. And that's part of the myth's tension. Apollo isn't just the god of music and medicine. He's also the god who believed his words carried the weight of eternity. When he spoke, mortals listened, and when he played, whole crowds swore they felt their souls rearranged. But power like that comes with danger. What happens when a god expects love and loyalty from everyone, but reality refuses to play along? You take a step closer and catch the detail the storytellers always emphasize: the radiance around him. In Greek art, Apollo is nearly always drawn with a crown of rays, like sunlight personified. And this wasn't just about vanity. The Greeks linked him to the sun. Oh, fun fact, that association only became strong later on. Earlier traditions actually gave the daily chariot ride across the sky to Helios, not Apollo. Scholars still debate how and when the god of music slid into the role of solar deity. Was it a political move, a cultural merge, or just poetic convenience? Still, for the ancient listener, Apollo was the golden boy. He brought order to chaos, rhythm to noise, health to sickness. At least, that was the ideal. But you already sense it beneath that glowing exterior. There's a god whose pride can curdle into something destructive. And that's where our story begins. Because what's about to unfold isn't a tale of a noble hero wooing a maiden with gentle charm. No, it's the messy story of how a god's unchecked confidence ran smack into human resistance and lost. And while you'd think that would humble him, Apollo, being Apollo, found a way to turn even defeat into a symbol. So here you are, standing at the very beginning. The sun is high, the air smells faintly of pine and thyme, and Apollo is about to meet someone who won't be dazzled by his golden glow, someone who will change him into a tree forever. The meadow shifts, you blink, and now the sunlight bends toward a smaller figure at the edge of the Sceneros, better known by his Roman name, Cupid. But don't picture the Valentine's Day cherub printed on greeting cards. This version is sharper, more mischievous, and frankly a little tired of being underestimated. His bow looks almost toy-like at first glance, but you quickly sense that this is no harmless accessory. Eros has been watching Apollo with a kind of irritation only a younger god feels when the older ones won't stop bragging. See, Apollo once mocked Eros, sneering that archery should be left to those with real skill. Is basically the mythological equivalent of saying, "Nice slingshot, kid, but leave the big weapons to the professionals." And if there's one thing you never do in a pantheon filled with fragile egos, it's taunt the god in charge of love. You hear Eros mutter under his breath, "You think you're untouchable, golden boy. Let's see how you like this." His fingers reach into a quiver that doesn't carry ordinary arrows. This quiver is a mood ring of destiny. And here's where the mythology gets oddly specific. He pulls out two arrows, each designed to tip the scales of the heart. One, gleaming gold, sharp enough to ignite a wildfire of passion. The other, dull and lead-tipped, heavy with apathy, designed to make love shrivel before it begins. And just like that, a prank is set into motion. Though calling it a prank feels almost delight, considering how it will echo through centuries of poetry and art. Imagine the god of love acting like a sibling out for revenge. Oh, you think you're invincible? Guess who's about to run straight into unrequited love? The bow creaks softly as Eros pulls back, the air thick with the tension of myth-making. He lets the first arrow fly golden on and it streaks across the sky, striking Apollo straight through the heart. No blood, no wound, just an invisible fire spreading through him, stronger than anything even a god can resist. Then comes the second shot, swift and merciless, and it's someone else standing in the shade. Daphne. She's the daughter of a river god, a nymph who values her freedom above all else. She feels the cold sting of the lead arrow, and instantly the very idea of romance curdles inside her chest. To her, love now tastes like ash, like a chain she cannot bear to wear. This is the setup, a god consumed by burning desire, a mortal determined to escape it. Ancient storytellers love this paradox. It's what made the myth both dramatic and strangely relatable. After all, who hasn't experienced love that wasn't returned, or affection that felt more like a burden than a gift? Scholars still debate what the myth was meant to teach. Some argue it's a warning about arrogance, like the wrong god, and you'll end up the butt of an eternal joke. Others see it as a metaphor for love's imbalance, desire and rejection dancing endlessly, never quite in sync. Whatever the interpretation, what you see before you now is the perfect storm. Apollo clutches his chest, his eyes widening as he catches sight of Daphne. His steps quicken instinctively, pulled not by logic but by that golden arrow's whisper. Meanwhile, Daphne's stomach twists. She doesn't need words to know what's coming. Her whole being screams to run. And you're caught between them, watching as two tiny arrows redraw the course of myth. The gods never do anything halfway, and Eros, with his slight grin, has assured this game is just getting started. The air feels heavier now, like the moment before a summer storm, except instead of rain, what's about to pour is drama. You glance over at Apollo, and he's practically glowing brighter than the sun itself. That golden arrow from Eros wasn't subtle. It's the kind of passion that grabs a god by the collar and says, "Congratulations, you're in love, whether you like it or not." Spoiler, Apollo likes it a lot. But this isn't your average Hallmark-style romance. No gentle harp music, no awkward but sweet exchanges of "So, what do you like to do on weekends?" No, Apollo is fully convinced he has just discovered the one. And when a god thinks he's found his soulmate, restraint usually takes the day off. Meanwhile, Daphne is standing under the shade of an olive tree, looking like someone who just received a spam text from an ex she never had. That dull, tipped arrow has already done its work. Her thoughts about Apollo, let's just say she files them under hard pass. To Daphne, the idea of being in love isn't just unappealing, it's repellent. You might as well offer her a bed of snakes or a lifetime supply of cold porridge. Apollo takes a bold step forward, voice ringing with a kind of poetic flair only a god of music could manage. He tries to charm her, words about her beauty, her grace, her radiance. He even drops some of those lofty lines the poets would later turn into verse. How her hair shines like the sun, how her skin outshines the marble of temples. If Instagram had existed back then, Apollo's captions would have been unbearable. But Daphne, she's not buying it. She edges back, eyes narrowing like a deer who hears the hunter's bowstring. And here's where the myth becomes fascinating. Most ancient Greek stories revolve around power and submission. But this one, it's about resistance. Daphne's refusal isn't just stubbornness, it's a whole worldview. She has sworn herself to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, vowing to remain unmarried, devoted to freedom and the wild. In other words, Daphne is a card-carrying member of Team Independence. You can almost hear the cosmic irony. Apollo, golden god of order and prophecy, versus Daphne, wild child of rivers and forests. One chase aim, one flame, and the tension. It's not just personal, it's symbolic. Love forced against will. Civilization trying to claim the untamed. Desire wrestling with freedom. Of course, ancient scholars didn't put it that way. They argued endlessly about whether Apollo's passion was real love or just divine arrogance, dressed up in fancy words. Some insisted Eros' golden arrow created a feeling too intense to be considered genuine. Others countered, saying maybe this was the god's way of showing that love, even in its rawest form, is both blessing and curse. The debate hasn't cooled down in 2,000 years, which makes you think, if professors are still arguing, maybe that's the point. This myth wasn't meant to be neatly resolved. You watch Apollo step closer, hand outstretched, the meadow trembling under the weight of his desire. Daphne takes another step back, and then another. Her heart pounds it with romance, but with the instinct to run. You get the distinct impression that the chase is only seconds away, and all the while, Eros sits in the background, perched on a rock, twirling his bow like a smug teenager who just pranked the entire cosmos. The meadow doesn't hold its breath for long. Daphne bolts a dramatic announcement. No second thoughts, just instinct taking the wheel. Her sandals barely touch the ground as she dashes through the grove, branches snapping in her wake. You try to keep up, but Apollo is faster still. His godlike stride devours the earth, and each step brings him closer to the girl who absolutely does not want to be caught. From where you stand, it's almost like watching a scene carved onto the side of an ancient vast fluid motion. The frantic arms, the pursuer and the pursued locked in a rhythm as old as storytelling itself. The Greeks adored this imagery. Passion running after resistance, love chasing freedom. In fact, so many surviving artworks depict this exact moment that you can practically hear the chorus of ancient artists whispering, "Yep, this is the good part." Apollo calls out as he runs, his words tumbling over one another. He promises that he isn't dangerous, that he means no harm, that all he wants is her companionship. Slow down, he pleads. You'll hurt yourself on the thorns. If you strip away the divine saying, it sounds almost like every desperate admirer in history fumbling for reasons why they should be trusted. But Daphne's ears are deaf to persuasion. Love repels her like two magnets flipped the wrong way. Here's where the myth slips into something more symbolic. The chase isn't just a physical pursuit, it's layered with meanings. To some ancient interpreters, it represented civilization chasing nature, man chasing woman, order chasing chaos. To others, it was more personal, Apollo chasing his own pride, trying to prove that not even a river nymph could resist his golden charm. And as usual, scholars still argue, was the myth written as a cautionary tale about unwanted desire, or simply a poetic metaphor for the impossible balance between longing and liberty? No consensus. Of course, the scenery shifts around you as the chase continues. Fields melt into forests, and forests into rocky hillsides. The cicadas hum, the wind tangles Daphne's hair, and Apollo's footsteps echo like thunder. You notice she isn't serene, at least not in spirit. Every movement is fueled by her vow to remain free, untouched, unclaimed, and yet her mortal legs are no match for a god whose muscles never ache. Ancient poets leaned into this tension, describing Apollo's thoughts as he closes in. He admires her running form, her hair streaming behind her, her speed that reminds him of Artemis' hunting companions. But admiration doesn't soften his pursuit, it sharpens it. To Apollo, her resistance only heightens the fire Eros lit in his heart. To Daphne, the same fire is suffocating, a blaze she cannot extinguish. You glance at Eros, still lingering off to the side, and for a split second, you're sure he smirks. This was always the plan. What better revenge than setting a god on a chase he can never truly win? And as the forest thickens, Daphne's breaths grow ragged. She knows Apollo's hand will touch her shoulder soon, but she also knows she's not finished fighting, because when gods press too close, nymphs turn to powers older than Olympus itself for help. You're running now, or at least you feel like you are at the ground thudding beneath your feet, leaves brushing against your arms, as Daphne's desperate spring pulls you into her wake. Her breath is sharp, her pulse uneven, but her will remains iron. She's no stranger to the wilderness. The forests are as much her home as Apollo's temple is. Yet even here, even in the shadows of her father's riverside domain, she feels the pressure of golden footsteps closing in. Apollo's voice rings out again, urgent but oddly gentle, like he believes his words might soften the terror of his chase. Don't run, Daphne. I'm not your enemy and your admirer. He promises safety, worship, even eternal fame. But promises, no matter how shiny, can undo the leaden curse sitting in Daphne's heart. Love, to her, is a trap, and no matter how Apollo dresses it up, it still looks like chains. She glances ahead, searching for escape, and her mind darts to the one power who might save her, her father, the river god Peneus. This is no idle thought. Nymphs often relied on their divine kin for aid, and Daphne knows that if anyone can shield her from Apollo's relentless pursuit, it's him. The forest narrows, trees press close like curious spectators. Apollo is nearly upon her now, fingertips brushing the air just shy of her cloak. And then it happens. Daphne cries out, her voice trembling with a kind of desperation that only comes when every moral option has run out. Father, help me, change me, destroy me, do anything but let me escape. The plea slices through the still air, raw and resolute, and as soon as the words leave her lips, something stirs beneath the soil. As though the river itself is listening, you stop in your tracks, sensing the moment shift. The ground cools, the air grows heavier, and Daphne's footsteps falternate from exhaustion. But from transformation, it begins subtly, her skin calling into a texture not quite human, her arms slowing as if the air had grown thick around them. Apollo reaches for her shoulder, and in that instant, he feels not warm flesh but something rougher, stranger bark. Daphne gasps as her fingers stretch upward, elongating into slender branches. Her hair cascades back, but instead of strands, it twists into shimmering leaves. Her feet root themselves into the soil, her body stiffening into trunk and stem. And just like that, the chase ends it with Apollo's victory, nor with Daphne's capture, but with her metamorphosis into the first laurel tree. You stand in awe, watching the forest hush itself. The birds pause their songs, the wind stills, even Apollo's footsteps fall silent. Transformation myths always carry this weight, the sense that you're witnessing a moment when human will collide with divine power, and the universe itself reshapes to honor it. Some scholars point out that this metamorphosis echoes older myths of escaped mortals turning into rivers, stars, or constellations when pressed by gods. Was it simply a narrative tool, or a reflection of human longing for freedom at any cost? The debate continues, because like all myths, the meaning never fully roots in just one place. What matters in this moment is Daphne's choice. She could not outrun a god, but she could outgrow him, and the price of that freedom, becoming something new, something permanent. Apollo staggers back, hand hovering over the bark where a shoulder once was. The chase is over, but the story is only deepening. For a long moment, Apollo just stands there. The golden fire that had pushed him into the chase still burns inside, but his hand rests against bark instead of skin, leaves instead of hair. It's as if his passion hit a wall, and the wall decided to grow roots. You see him press his palm to the trunk, almost tenderly, almost in disbelief. His voice lowers, no longer the commanding tone of a god expecting to be obeyed, but something softer, something painfully human. Daphne. Her eyes are gone now, closed within the wood, but her spirit lingers. You sense it in the rustle of the new leaves, in the steady pulse of life flowing through the laurel's veins. She hasn't vanished. Not really. She's simply become untouchable in a new way. Apollo circles the tree like a musician circling a new instrument, unsure whether to weep or worship. And then, in that godlike way of rewriting tragedy into symbolism, he does what only a deity could do. He turns grief into ritual. I cannot have you, he says quietly, but I will keep you. His fingers trail along the branches, gathering the leaves as though each were a keepsake. From now on, this tree will be mine. Its crown will honor heroes, poets, and victors. Its branches will never wither. Its leaves will never fade. Laurel will be eternal as the fire that brought me here. And just like that, a curse becomes a blessing, or perhaps it's a little of both. The laurel tree, born of resistance, is claimed as Apollo's sacred symbol. Crowns of laurel will later rest on the heads of Olympians, generals, and emperors, all unknowingly carrying the story of a nymph who refused a god. You notice something strange as you lean against a nearby oak. This story isn't about Apollo winning. It isn't even about Daphne losing. It's about transformation, her choice to change rather than be claimed. His choice to sanctify rather than destroy. It's messy, bittersweet, and yet oddly beautiful. Historians still argue over the meaning. Some say Apollo's declaration was selfish, a way of softening his failure and rebranding it as victory. Others suggest it was an act of reverence, a recognition that Daphne's will deserve to be immortalized. Maybe both are true. That's the thing with myths. They thrive in contradictions. What is clear is how far this moment traveled. From Greek games to Roman triumphs, Laurel became shorthand for glory, creativity, and endurance. And every time a crown of leaves circled someone's head, it echoed this very scene: Apollo's outstretched hand, Daphne's final transformation, the silence that followed. As you stand there, you feel a breeze stir through the laurel tree. The leaves shimmer faintly, as if whispering secrets in a language too old for translation. And though the goddess of the hunt may never let her nymph speak again, the tree itself seems to hum with a kind of freedom Daphne chose, carved into wood and leaf. Apollo lowers his head, presses his lips to the bark, and steps back. He has gained a symbol, but lost the woman. You sense that contradiction will haunt him for eternity. The forest is hushed, like even the cicadas have decided this moment is too sacred to interrupt. Apollo steps back from the laurel tree, his face still lit with that impossible mixture of devotion and defeat. He touches the leaves again, gently, as though testing their permanence. They don't crumble, they don't fade, and in the moment he realizes if Daphne cannot be his beloved, she can at least be eternal. You notice how quickly he shifts gears. That's the advantage of being a god. When life hands you heartbreak, you don't write sad songs on your lyre, you declare a tree sacred for all eternity. Apollo raises his voice so even the mountains hear. From now on, laurel shall be my crown. It will rest on the heads of victors, poets, and seers. No withering shall touch it, no winter strip it bare. This will be the evergreen of glory. It sounds grand, and maybe a little dramatic, but that's how gods operate, turning personal losses into universal rituals. And sure enough, laurel becomes the plant of prophecy and triumph, the leaf of poetic inspiration, the wreath of Olympic winners. Every ancient athlete straining under the Greek sun, every poet whispering to their muse, carried a little echo of this moment whether they knew it or not. Still, the irony doesn't escape you. The crown of winners came from a chase that ended in refusal. The emblem of poetic inspiration was born not from romance fulfilled, but from love denied. Even as Apollo speaks, you feel the contradiction hum in the air. Glory born of grief. Scholars point out that this wasn't unusual for myth. Symbols often grew from strange soil. Olive trees sprang from Athena's quarrel with Poseidon, peacocks from Hera's jealous watch, constellations from mortals unlucky enough to catch a god's attention. Was Apollo sanctifying Daphne as an act of honor, or simply branding her as property in disguise? The academic debates are endless. And honestly, they're unlikely to be settled because myths, like laurel leaves, twist whichever way the wind blows. You step closer to the tree, running your fingers over the bark. The texture is cool, rough, alive, and as the wind stirs, the leaves whisper it in words, but in a sound that feels like resistance turned into song. For Daphne, this wasn't defeat. She never gave in, never surrendered her vow. Instead, she redefined her existence. She escaped the pursuit by becoming something untouchable, rooted yet free. Apollo plucks a branch, waving the first laurel crown. His hands, so used to strings and bowstrings, tremble just a little. He places it on his own head, and the image is both majestic and mournful, the god of light wearing the shadow of his greatest loss. From now on, every wreath of laurel will carry that echo, and every time you see one in a museum case or on an emperor's marble bust, you'll know the hidden story. A nymph who said no, and a god who turned her refusal into a symbol that outlived them both. The scene shifts again, and you're no longer standing in the quiet grove. Instead, The air smells of dust and sweat, and the sound of cheering swells around you. You've been dropped straight into the ancient Olympic Games. Runners dart past in flashes of bronze skin. Discus throwers went up with practiced grace, and the crowd erupts as one competitor surges ahead. And there it is, prize, not gold, not jewels, not even a shiny medal. A simple wreath, woven from fresh laurel leaves, waiting to crown the victor's head. You watch as the athlete, chest still heaving, bends forward, and the judge places the wreath gently on his brow. The crowd roars, and the runner lifts his arms in triumph. Laurel leaves trembling in the sun. It feels almost quaint compared to modern trophies. But that's the point. The Greeks didn't need glitter and objects to prove honor. The laurel crown carried Apollo's promise, that blend of eternal life and eternal story. It was lightweight, green, and very symbolic to where Laurel was to stand in the same story as Daphne thought most athletes were probably too tired to think about mythology while gasping for air. You glance around at the crowd, and it's fascinating how seriously they take it. Victors were immortalized in song, painted on pottery, celebrated in their home cities. Sometimes they even got free meals for life. Imagine going to your local diner and being told, "Yep, pancakes on the house forever, because you run real fast once." That's the kind of perk Laurel could bring. Of course, scholars still puzzle over why Laurel, specifically, held such staying power. Was it simply because Apollo declared it sacred? Was it because the evergreen nature of the leaves symbolized endurance? Or was it because the myth of Daphne captured something deeper, the idea that glory comes not just from victory, but from struggle and loss as well? No definitive answer, as usual, but you can see how the symbolism worked. Laurel wasn't flashy, but it was dignified. It didn't shout, but it whispered. And sometimes whispers carry further than shouts. Wearing it tied you back not only to Apollo, but also to the entire lineage of those who resisted, transformed, and endured. As you watch another victor crowned, you catch a strange detail. The judges handle the wreath with reverence, almost as if they're afraid of breaking it. They knew the story, too. This wasn't just a plant, it was a myth woven into leaves. You lean back on the warm stone of the stadium, lulled by the rhythmic chants of the spectators. For a moment, you realize the games weren't just competitions. They were rituals, binding athletes to gods, myths to mortals, victories to the quiet rustling of a tree born from refusal. And the laurel leaves, they shimmer in the sunlight, carrying a secret that only those who know Daphne's story will ever hear. The cheers of the stadium fade, and when your eyes adjust again, you're no longer among athletes. Instead, you're seated in a dim, quiet room. A single figure sits across from you, a poet hunched over a wax tablet. His hair is messy, his clothes ink-stained, but his eyes burn with that familiar, restless spark look of someone waiting for inspiration to arrive. On his desk rests a small sprig of laurel. He touches it absent-mindedly as though hoping the leaves will whisper a line of verse into his ear. And in a way, that's exactly what Apollo promised. After Daphne's transformation, laurel didn't just become the crown of victors. It became the sacred badge of poets and prophets, to where laurel was to claim Apollo's favor, to channel divine breath into moral words. You can almost hear the poet muttering to himself. He scratches out lines, reshapes them, hums out finished verses. Every so often, he pauses, gazing at the laurel branch, like it might scold him if he rhymes badly. And maybe that's the charm, believing the leaves carry the memory of Daphne, the spirit of resistance, the fire of Apollo's unfulfilled desire. all pressing the writer to dig deeper. Over in Delphi, priests and priestesses clutch Laurel too. You picture the famous oracle, seated on her tripod, smoke curling around her, chewing laurel leaves before speaking prophecies. The taste must have been bitter, resinous, but that bitterness was part of the ritual. Laurel was thought to purge, to cleanse, to open the mind to visions. People traveled for weeks just to hear her words, convinced the leaves connected her mouth directly to Apollo's voice. And it's here you realize how strange this transformation really was. A woman trying to escape becomes a tree becomes a crown becomes the source of human creativity and divine speech. Out of grief grew poetry, out of refusal grew prophecy. Myths are nothing if not recycling programs for meaning. Academics still debate why laurel, not some other plant, carried this weight. Some argue its evergreen leaves symbolize eternity, a natural metaphor for inspiration that never dies. Others suggest it was simple pragmatism. Laurel was common around Greece, sturdy enough to weave, aromatic enough to feel magical. The truth, probably a blend of the mystical and the mundane as myths usually are. You lean closer to the poet's tablet, watching him finally etch a line that makes him smile. He dips the stylus, writes another, and before long, his voice carries a melody through the room. It's rough, imperfect, but it has that same spark poets across centuries would chase, believing a sprig of laurel could fan it into flame. Somewhere, Apollo listens, and somewhere deeper, beneath bark and roots, maybe Daphne listens too. The poet's voice fades, and the room around you dissolves. Suddenly, you're standing in a very different kind of city room. The air smells of marble dust and iron, and somewhere in the distance you hear the rumble of chariots. Statues line the streets, arches tower over the crowd, and at the very center of it all stands a man draped in crimson, wearing a crown of few guessed it laurel. This isn't just any man. He's a Roman general returning from victory, leading his soldiers in a triumphal procession. The crowd shouts, tossing flowers, waving cloth, but what they're really waiting for is the moment when he rides through the streets crowned with Apollo's evergreen symbol. Laurel here doesn't just whisper of poetry. It shouts of power, conquest, and the favor of the gods. You follow the procession as the general lifts his head proudly, the laurel wreath catching the sunlight. Behind him, soldiers carry spoils of war, gold, exotic animals, and statues looted from faraway temples. Yet the laurel crown, so simple compared to the riches, is what gives the victory legitimacy. Rome inherited Greece's myths and polished them into propaganda. A sprig of leaves became the stamp of empire. And it wasn't just generals. Emperors, too, wore laurel wreaths to signal divine blessing. Coins from Augustus to Constantine show profiles adorned with laurel, as if the empire itself leaned on Daphne's transformation for credibility. It's funny, isn't it? A nymph who once just wanted to be left alone ends up tied to the image of emperors ruling half the known world. That's mythology for you. Private struggles becoming public symbols. But Rome had its own twist. To the Greeks, laurel was Apollo's domain, tied to music and prophecy as much as victory. To the Romans, it tilted heavily toward triumph. Laurel-lined fasces, laurel crowns, laurel on temples. The tree became part of Rome's visual vocabulary. They even planted groves of laurel near the Capitoline Hill, so victors could pluck fresh branches to weave their own crowns. Still, not everyone agreed on its meaning. Ancient writers argue in their dusty scrolls, was laurel meant to protect generals from envy? Was it a symbol of purification after the bloodshed of war? Or was it simply borrowed prestige from Apollo, imported wholesale into Roman politics? The debates echo like a chorus across centuries, leaving us with more questions than answers. As the procession winds down, you notice the general dismounting at the steps of Jupiter's temple. He removes his wreath, lays it on the altar, and bows, even in triumph. The crown wasn't his to keep forever. Victory was temporary. Laurel had to be returned to the gods, as though to remind mortal seven the most powerful that their glory was only ever borrowed. And in that gesture, you hear Daphne's voice again, the quiet reminder that freedom and defiance still linger in those leaves, no matter who wears them. The roar of Rome dissolves into a hush. You find yourself walking through a gallery in marble temples this time, but a museum. The walls are pale, that air faintly cool, and statues stand on pedestals like frowning witnesses of old stories. You wander past busts of emperors, shelves of pottery, and then you stop. There she is again, Daphne, or rather, Bernini's Daphne, mid-transformation, her fingers stretching into branches, her hair unraveling into leaves while Apollo reaches forward, his hand just brushing her skin. The sculpture is centuries younger than the myth, but the marble is alive with motion. Even the folds of Daphne's robe seem to ripple, as though you can still hear her fleeing. It's startlingly beautiful, but also unsettling. Apollo's expression is urgent, almost pleading, while Daphne's face twists away in fear and determination. The story may be ancient, but in art it feels immediate, forever replayed in cold stone. You lean closer, tracing the details, the rough bark creeping up her legs, the delicate veins carved into each marble leaf. Bernini captured the moment of transformation so precisely you almost forget it's rock. And it's not just this one piece. You turn down another corridor, and there are paintings. Apollo chasing Daphne across golden fields, Apollo grieving at the base of the laurel, laurel wreaths woven into the hands of poets, warriors, even saints. Each artist chose a different second of the story, as if unsure which heartbeat carried the most meaning. Was it the chase, the prayer, the metamorphosis, or Apollo's mournful embrace of the tree? Historians love to argue here, too. Some claim artists were fascinated by the tension between beauty and violence, a desire crashing against refusal. Others insist the myth became a metaphor for artistic inspiration itself, the fleeting, uncatchable muse. Once again, no one agrees, but maybe that's what makes the story so endlessly compelling. It resists closure, just like Daphne resisted capture. You pause before one vase painting, where Apollo is depicted not as a glowing god, but almost comically exaggerated arms flailing, expression desperate, while Daphne sprints like an athlete toward safety. You chuckle softly. Even in antiquity, artists weren't afraid to poke a little fun at divine obsession. After all, what's more human than watching a god trip over his own pride? As you move along, you realize how the myth keeps shifting depending on the medium. In marble, it feels tragic. In pottery, almost humorous. In paintings, often romanticized. And in every version, laurel leaves frame the edges, reminding you that no matter how the story is retold, the ending always settles into branches and bark. You leave the gallery, but the images linger. It strikes you how art has kept Daphne alive perhaps more vividly than Apollo ever could. Immortal not as a lover, not as prey, but as a moment of transformation captured again and again, until even you feel the weight of bark creeping up your own arms. You step outside the gallery, and the air feels warmer, heavier, as though you've walked into Apollo's own thoughts. He's no longer chasing, He's remembering. You can almost hear his inner voice. Was it love? Or was it pride? This is the part of the story where mythologists put down their lyres and pick up their pens. Because as beautiful as the laurel crown looks, the psychology behind it is messier. Apollo insists he loved Daphne, but how much of that was true affection, and how much was bruised ego after being mocked by Eros? Imagine a god humiliated by a child with wings, suddenly scrambling to prove he's still irresistible. That's less Cupid's arrow and more divine overcompensation. Some scholars argue Apollo's passion was never love at all, it was obsession fueled by magic. And Eros' trick. If love is supposed to be about choice, where's the choice when desire is imposed by force? Others counter, isn't all passion irrational? Maybe the myth was pointing out that love itself is something beyond consent, something chaotic, destabilizing, even for gods. And of course, the academic debates go in circles, like they always do. You picture Apollo pacing near the Laurel, trying to convince himself it was love. He mutters, it had to be, but the more he says it, the less convinced he sounds. Daphne's side of the story is even more fascinating. She never asked to be the target of a god's affection, never sought divine glory. She just wanted freedom. To her, Apollo's love wasn't a gift but a burden, an intrusion. In a way, her transformation into a tree wasn't escape alone, it was defiance. She became something Apollo could never fully possess. You stand there, listening to the wind shift through the laurel branches, a sound almost like laughter. Maybe Daphne's victory wasn't in fleeing or in changing, but in rewriting the terms entirely. And here's the strange part. Apollo's curse is fire for her that never becomes his own prison. Every time he sees Laurel, he remembers what he could not have. His grief is evergreen, just like the leaves. If you think about it, Daphne cursed him too. In her own quiet way, he crowned himself with the very thing that reminded him of his failure. Talk about irony. You run your hand along the trunk again, and the bark feels alive beneath your fingers, pulsing faintly. This isn't just myth, it's psychology dressed in poetry. Apollo thought he was chasing love, but really, he was chasing his own reflection, his pride, his belief that nothing was beyond his reach. And Daphne, she proved him wrong in the most permanent way imaginable. The forest hums around you, and you realize the story isn't simply about gods and mortals. It's about the fragile boundary between desire and respect, between passion and possession. And even now, thousands of years later, people still argue where Apollo stood on that line. Maybe he never knew himself. The wind rustles, and the scent around you shifts again at incense. Not marble, but something sharper, greener. You look down, and the laurel leaves in your hand aren't just symbols anymore. They're medicine. Somewhere in antiquity, healers began grinding, steeping, and chewing them, convinced the tree carried Apollo's blessing into the body. You sit cross-legged in a courtyard, where an old herbalist stirs a clay pot over a small flame. Steam curls upward, carrying the faint aroma of bay leaves. He plucks one from a bundle, drops it into the simmering brew, and tells you in a matter-of-fact tone, this is for clearing the chest, for calming the stomach. Apollo gave us this, and here's the twist, isn't entirely wrong. Laurel, or bay, did find its way into ancient medicine. Greek and Roman texts list it as a treatment for everything from coughs to snake bites. The leaves were sometimes burned as incense to purify spaces, their oil rubbed into sore muscles. Even now, the spice rack in your kitchen might carry a descendant of Daphne's tree, tucked between the cinnamon and oregano. The myth traveled all the way to Yerstapot, You sip the brew cautiously. The taste is bitter, a little woody, but not unpleasant. You imagine oracles in Delphi chewing the same leaves, smoke clinging to their robes, voices trembling with Apollo's supposed visions. Maybe the bitterness itself helped sharpen the sense of being touched by something divine. Of course, scholars today argue about whether Laurel was truly psychoactive or simply symbolic. Some insist the fumes and leaves triggered altered states, making prophecy possible. Others say it was nothing but ritual, theater smoke, chants, and belief doing all the work. The truth, hard to pin down, and likely somewhere in between. Humans have always been good at convincing themselves that a strange taste equals a spiritual experience. But medicine, in its quiet way, gave the myth a longer life. Even when poets stopped writing about Daphne, cooks and healers kept plucking laurel leaves, tying them to Apollo's wisdom. The connection between myth and medicine blurred. Was the tree sacred because it healed, or did it heal because it was sacred? You lean back, cup warm in your hands, and it hits you how deeply the story has rooted itself into daily life. A nymph once fleeing through the forest becomes the leaf in someone's soup, the oil in someone's sap, the smoke curling through someone's prayer. Myth and medicine intertwined like vines. The herbalist sets down his spoon and smiles knowingly, as if to say, "You see, the gods never left us. They just hide in the leaves." The courtyard fades, and you find yourself sitting by a campfire, the kind where stories pass from mouth to mouth instead of pen to parchment. The flames flicker on the faces of travelers who've stopped for the night, and one begins to tell a version of the tale you thought you already knew. Except this Daphne doesn't turn into a tree. In this telling, she's whisked away by Artemis herself, hidden deep in the mountains, never touched by Apollo's pursuit. In another variation, Daphne becomes a spring of water instead, her voice forever bubbling in the stream. And then there's the strangest one, a fragment where Apollo actually marries her, and she willingly becomes his consort. Each version contradicts the last, like pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together. You realize myths were monologues, they were conversations, reshaped by each storyteller, adjusted to fit each audience. For some listeners, Daphne's resistance was the highlight. For others, her union with Apollo made the better ending. The myth was a mirror, reflecting what each community needed to hear. Even ancient scholars complained about this. One commentator in the Roman era grumbled that the poets cannot agree on whether Daphne fled, transformed, or consented. Yet maybe that confusion was the point. A story that changes form, like Daphne herself, survives longer. It makes you wonder, how many tales are we missing entirely? How many fireside versions slipped away when the storyteller's voice went silent, never written down? The fragments we have are like scattered leaves, enough to sketch the outline of a tree but never the whole grove. What's fascinating is how the tone shifts with each retelling. In Greece, the story feels tragic, highlighting resistance and transformation. In Rome, it leans triumphal, focusing on the laurel as imperial symbol. Later Christian writers reinterpreted it as a moral tale about chastity. Daphne praised for rejecting lust. And in Renaissance art, it morphed again, this time into an allegory for fleeting beauty. So when someone asks, what does the story of Apollo and Daphne mean? The honest answer is, it depends. The myth is a river with many tributaries, and every culture that touched it carved a new path. You glance back at the fire, the storyteller's voice is soft, rhythmic, and you feel your eyes growing heavy. The words blur, and in that blur lies the truth. Myths don't belong to one ending. They live in the retelling, always a little different, always reshaping themselves, just like Daphne's own metamorphosis. And as the fire dies down, the smoke curling into the night sky, you sense that somewhere out there, Apollo still chases, Daphne still flees, and the story still twists into new forms. Never quite finished. The campfire dims, and the world shifts one last time. You're standing at the edge of a grove where the air feels timeless. As though centuries have folded in on themselves, the laurel tree is here again, taller now, branches stretching like arms that learned to embrace the sky instead of a god. You can hear the rustling leaves whispering, not in panic, but in calm defiance. Apollo is nowhere in sight. Maybe he's given up, maybe he's sulking, or maybe he simply retreated into his songs. But the tree remains, and so does the paradox it represents. Why does this myth still matter? Why does a nymph turning into bark echo louder than so many grand battles or divine quarrels? You lean against the trunk, and the answers seem to unfurl like leaves. On one level, it's about desire that cannot be fulfilled, something every listener, God or moral, understands. On another, it's about freedom, Daphne choosing transformation over submission. And on yet another, it's about the uneasy truth that even gods cannot always get what they want. It's tempting to read it romantically, as a tragic love story, but step closer, and you realize it's not love at all. It's about boundaries. It's about saying no so firmly that the universe itself has to reshape to respect it. That's why the story still stirs debate. Was Apollo cursed with eternal longing, or was Daphne blessed with eternal freedom? Maybe both. The myth lingers, because it captures a tension that never goes away. Desire and refusal, pursuit and escape, pride and humility. These pairs chase each other through every human story, looping endlessly, just like Apollo chasing Daphne through the woods. You think of all the places the laurel has traveled since then, from temples to stadiums, from poets' desks to emperors' brows. From your soup pot to your bookshelf, every leaf carries the memory of a chase that never resolved. Every crown carries the weight of someone who once said, I would rather become something else entirely than lose myself. And maybe that's why you're here tonight, listening, because myths like this don't fade, they root themselves, grow new branches, and keep whispering long after the gods themselves have quieted. You close your eyes, and the forest hums softly around you. The leaves sway, and you swear you can hear Daphne's voice in their song. Not a cry of fear anymore, but a steady lullaby, rustling you toward rest. And now, the grove grows quiet. The story has run its course. The chase has ended, and you are left only with the gentle sway of leaves in the dark. The sound is slow, steady, almost like breathe, nature's way of reminding you that everything finds its rhythm in the end. Apollo's fire, Daphne's flight, the arrows of Eros, all of it softens into something far simpler. The hush of branches moving against the night air. The myth no longer demands your attention. It lingers like a faint melody, one you don't need to follow, because it will always be here, waiting. You imagine lying back beneath the laurel tree, the earth cool beneath you, the leaves drifting like fragments of an old song. The gods feel distant now, their voices fading, until all that remains is the calm certainty of silence. Even the questions, debates, the disputes, the scholarly arguments blur into the background. What matters is the stillness. So let your shoulders loosen, let your thoughts untangle. You don't need to chase meaning any more than Apollo needed to chase Daphne. The story is enough, and you are enough, just resting here in its shade. The night folds gently around you, and the rustle of leaves becomes a lullaby. Breathe with it slowly until sleep takes you.